Well, I'm really pleased to introduce Casey Costello, all the way from across the ditch in New Zealand, from the Hobson Pledge movement in New Zealand. Uh, Casey, a lot of the people who subscribe to this channel are really people who are curious as to whether they should vote no or not to the up and coming Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Voice to Parliament referendum debate. And so I thought it was a wonderful idea to be able to have some type of international comparison between two different countries. In fact, I'd like to have multiple different countries, but two different countries with similar histories. As I understand it, New Zealand, the Maori people, I think settled there. They were Polynesian people settled there in the 13th century. And then I think it was Abel Tasman that came along and mapped the country in about 1642, similar to us down there in Tasmania. And then Captain Cook, I think, in the late 1777 or something, 1770s, when he came down and mapped the place. Then, so we've got a similar type of history up to that very early point. What happened in around the 1840s?
So 1840 for New Zealand was effectively what we viewed as the forming of our nation. So on February the 6th, 1840, the representative of the British Crown, Sir Governor Hobson, entered into a treaty with Māori. And I think to put some context in, it's important to understand that at the time, Māori didn't consider themselves as one people. We were very tribal people. We're very affiliated to our land and the areas we occupied. But at the time, also to be of note, is that Māori significantly outnumbered the number of settlers that were in New Zealand at the time. There was very few settlers, but there had been some concerns for Māori, both in terms of the French threat, that the French were likely to come in and take over, and also there was a lot of conflict within the Māori tribes themselves. So the treaty was a way of forming effectively an agreement between two what was conceived as sovereign identities. And it was a very simple document and pretty much unprecedented from what I can understand of history around the world at the time. It was effectively 3 articles simply written. And the big disputes around New Zealand has been, which version of the treaty text do you listen to? Because there's Māori text and there's English text and there's rewritten version that was sent back to the Crown that was sort of dressed up to make look pretty, and all of those sort of historical discussions that you have. But fundamentally, the treaty was 3 articles that said, first and foremost, that sovereignty was ceded to Queen Victoria, that she was the sovereign identity of the nation, so effectively the chief ceded sovereignty. Then the second article, which was effectively assuring or making sure that Māori would retain their property rights, their ownership, and there was lots of discussion about what that property meant and the ramifications, but effectively, simply, you could carry on owning your property and your property rights would be respected. And the final article, Article 3, which was probably the key to this whole discussion, is that that all the people of New Zealand would be afforded the same rights and privileges of British subjects. So effectively, it meant that everybody would be treated equally before the law. And then pretty much after the treaty was signed, we went about our business of forming a nation. Now, like any fledgling nation, there has been good and bad things done. There's been, overstepping of power by the Crown. There's been some, ill treatment, but there was equally a lot of conflict between Māori, and a lot of atrocities occurred between Māori tribes over those periods as well. So the 1860s were a pretty grim time in New Zealand with warring going on between peoples, and so there was things, but we were forming nation, and then pretty much the treaty was left in the background. We carried on living as a nation and it was a respected document in terms of forming our nation, and but really didn't interfere with how the nation was formed as such. But it was a checks and balance to make sure that Māori were afforded some rights, and then we moved forward to about the 1970s, when there was some issues around how the claims of breaches of the treaty were occurred, and I think, to be fair, no one in New Zealand has suggested that we shouldn't be addressing wrongs that occurred. I don't think there's any sort of civilized nation that doesn't think that where the government has wronged a people, there shouldn't be some degree of pushing right, and that's kind of where the treaty changed in terms of how it was applied, and then we move forward to sort of the current day around how.
So how did the treaty change in the mid '70s?
So there was first of all, there was the establishment of the Waitangi Tribunal. So the Waitangi Tribunal was established by legislation in 1975, and it was established as a
Was it a high court
no,
decision?
this was an act of parliament. So this is before the lands case occurred. So the Waitangi
Right.
Tribunal was established as a mechanism to ensure that these issues could be heard. So, there was a process put in place where a tribunal was
Mm.
established, to hear and progress claims against the treaty. And bear in mind, there'd been claims about treaty breaches, dating into the 1800s. There had been, redress by the Crown to sort out where land was illegally confiscated, those sort of things. So, but the tribunal was established in 1975. But then we went on to what's become as the groundbreaking case for New Zealand, which was the 1986 case, which is referred to as the lands case. And the lands case became groundbreaking because it was a claim to the tribunal, the Waitangi Tribunal, effectively saying that the Crown couldn't sell state assets without referring to Māori, because the concern was that land that was disputed by Māori was going to be sold off by the state, by the government, and therefore Māori couldn't make the claims against those lands once they were put into private ownership. So the justification for the case was, reasonably solid, and why that changed the framework for New Zealand was that the ruling said, which has been misquoted a number of times, it was inferred that the Crown was in partnership with Māori. Now, that isn't actually what the case said. The case said there was a fiduciary relationship akin to a partnership. So it was saying that, the two parties should, deal with each other, with consideration, respect, and there should be good faith in the discussions between the two parties, etc., etc. But what occurred from that case is it basically said that New Zealand was formed in a partnership between the Crown and Māori. Now, that's where you come unstuck. That's where you kind of end up in this, do you have a democracy, or do you have a tribal identity? And
And this was a ruling by that's equivalent of our High
yeah, yeah.
Court.
So I think it actually went,
So not a decision made by the democracy, but by
yeah,
by
by the
the
judiciary.
court
Yeah.
system.
So the
So
judiciary
yeah.
made a decision, and from that decision, we've ended up with a whole lot of. So we've ended up with legislation, because what's occurred is that when you've said that you formed a partnership, that kind of confuses your democratic identity. And we've had leaders as diverse as David Lange, infamous or famous Labor Prime Minister, Bill English, who was the leader of the National Party and took over after John Key resigned. We've had Winston Peters, who was Deputy Prime Minister of the previous Labor government, and leader of the New Zealand First Party, himself Māori, all said it's nonsense to suggest that the Crown formed a partnership with effectively a tribal people. To suggest Queen Victoria said, I'm going to co-govern this country, is just nonsense. And you can't have a democracy and and a part tribal control entity. So it's just a nonsense. You're either a democratic nation. Then out of that, we had all of these.
Is that the language that you use in New Zealand? Is it co-governance?
Well,
Is that the language
this is what's occurred.
you use? Like,
This is what's come about recently, and I think this is the part that's confusing, because we had this partnership idea, and that was under the treaty, and then we had principles of the treaty, which again was this wishy-washy kind of, we've got to comply with the really undefined principles of the treaty, which means that anything you want it to mean. And then kind of that morphed more recently under the current government with this idea of co-governance. Now, we've had treaty settlements. So this is, a legislation that was passed as a reparation or a reconciliation process over a treaty claim. And out of that claim, there's been, types of co-governance over natural resources, parks, rivers, those sort of things. Like there's been in the management of this, entity, whatever it might be, a river or a park or whatever, there'll be an agreement of, partnership control over this entity. Under the current government, co-governance was broadened, and co-governance has been legislated effectively. And co-governance is now this idea that you will co-govern something. And so in New Zealand, we've had legislation that established a Māori Health Authority, effectively co-governing health. So on a race-based idea that you'll have health managed by Māori and managed by the rest of New Zealanders, and the delivery of services would be in a co-governed relationship. The next one, which has been the most contentious, is the co-governing of water. And that's the most frightening component, because effectively that says that water, which is controlled by local bodies, local authorities, and ratepayers, effectively homeowners, pay for. The government's come in and said, we're not doing a good enough job, there's problems with water, lots of scaremongering about the reality of the situation with water, but that was why they drove this campaign. And they're going to remove, through this legislation, which has been passed, ownership of those water. So that's fresh water, stormwater and wastewater, the three water systems, to these massive entities that are being created. And those entities are going to be 50% controlled by iwi or Māori tribes, and 50% by appointments from the local government. So the water, the water that you drink, the water that you manage for floods, the water that you dispose of, is going to be transferred in ownership to 50% control of iwi, who are roughly 15% of the New Zealand population. So massively concerning that this, and the problem with the co-governance model is that there's no framework under which Māori representation is elected or appointed or accountable. It's an appointment by a tribal process. Generally, it's been proven to demonstrate a lot of conflict within the tribes themselves as to who's authorised to speak and not authorised to speak and all those sort of things. But a massive, massive issue. And under this newly appointed Prime Minister, they've now come out to say that there's co-governance, this distrust of co-governance. It's just a misunderstanding. It's a branding problem. You don't really understand what co-governance means. And so now they've decided that because co-governance has become tainted, they're going to call it something else. But it hasn't changed the legislation. We still have co-government of public services, and that's where we've got to now with this big debate over what does co-governance actually mean. And there's been a whole lot of stuff that's gone in behind it.
So, referring to the Australian context, so in about 75, in a sense, the reinterpretation of the treaty was to enable, in a sense, greater say, in a sense, similar to the
Exactly.
concept of
Yeah.
voice.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's the
And
argument.
as Right. So, and as time has evolved, it is what you're showing is that what's occurred in New Zealand has it's evolved from, in a sense, a mechanism to have a say, like a voice, but into a sovereign authority to create a like one country, two
Exactly.
nations
Yeah.
type.
Yeah.
Oh,
And that was, I suppose that's when it,
that occurred over, say, 50
yeah.
years.
And
Mm,
that's the challenge where you look at this exactly, and that's to me what I saw was it's the same language. It's the, we want to hear, we want to ensure that the best outcomes are being delivered. Yeah, all the nice things, and
mm,
that this. How could you not want this? But
mm,
the journey that you're going down is there's no way that you become a nation of two peoples, and that's where you choose ethnicity over citizenship, that you become divided. And at its heart, how do you diminish the idea of racism or racial division or whatever you call it by making race the basis of everything that you form, in terms of your policy and processes? You're going to make race the primary consideration. The other factor is that, and what got me involved in pushing back against the stuff that was going on in New Zealand, was this idea that there was these self-appointed voices, and generally it was the same people popping up all the time, and you'll have them in Australia that, whenever there's some, there's a dollar to be made, the same voices will pop up claiming to speak for all Māori. And I started to go, well, hang on, you haven't asked me, and you don't speak for me, and why have you been given this mandate or authority to claim to represent me? And the other driver was that you perpetuate a victim narrative. You perpetuated that being Māori, predetermined you for failure in some aspects. It was like this: we expect less of you. Now how demoralising for our young people to be told that you're so different from the rest of your country. That you are so different that we're going to create this separate table for you to sit at. And then how do you ensure that the people speaking are actually representing the interests of their people and not representing the interests of themselves? How do you ensure? And we've had, as you say, nearly 50 years of putting right. And in every measure that you can assess the success of a people by race, Māori have tracked downwards in terms of educational outcomes, incarceration, health, home ownership, employment. All of these statistics, Māori have continued to track backwards.
oh, oh. So, in other words, the practical outcomes of this voice didn't translate into better social and
No.
economic outcomes.
And what you have is the less accountability or transparency, because it's this tribal component where you can't ask for accountability, you can't ask for the evidence of where this money is going, and you can't, because it's so it all becomes grey, murky sort of area with um,
There seems to be a concept in Australia, I think, that underpins the idea. Be interesting to see the New Zealand experience, whereby only Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can speak for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander
yeah.
peoples.
And I have a big issue with that, because it's if you were unwell and you weren't, you were sick and you needed some expertise to get well, you don't go and talk to someone else who's sick. You talk to the very best people with the very best skills and capability to give you the very best solutions.
Mm.
and that's
No matter what their skin
no,
colour.
exactly, and that's that idea that because I don't have your color, and also the idea that there is, well, I'd suggest there's no Māori who are 100% Māori who've not been over the generations, um, um, mixed heritage of mixed ancestry.
Mm.
So this idea that you're kind of you're divided by some arbitrary, it's just it's this ethno nationalism idea, this idea that we're
Mm.
ethnic people in a nation, and we're not a nation, we're not a multicultural, and we were a nation.
Well, you're actually quite a famous multicultural
Exactly, and
society.
that was
And,
that was our
mm,
bastion. That was what we flew our flag high. But now we're being forced into being a bicultural nation, and we have a saying in my family where we talk about porgs, and in New Zealand, and I don't like the term, but this in New Zealand you call someone who isn't Maori a Pākehā, and so we
mm.
call porgs Pākehā awash with guilt. That they are the ones that we must do more for these people, and don't realize at their heart what they're saying is insulting and derogatory and demeaning and patronizing, to suggest that we can't achieve on our merit, we can't achieve on our skills and capability. We need this special kind of consideration. Now, social services,
It's
assistance,
interesting.
everything should be based upon need. To say that you will differentiate the treatment of a system based upon their race is at its very heart the most racist decision you can make.
Mm.
And just as you said, we start off with these all very well meaning, we're just gonna, this is our pathway to improve outcomes, but it became an industry, it became a business of this idea of representation and division and all those sort of things. It's a business where the only people profiting off this are lawyers and consultants and self-appointed trustees, but those most in need remain most in need.
So this is really interesting. So has there been? So how is this? Well, I suppose how are race relations going in New
Yeah, and
Zealand?
that was the part that shocked me, was this, we can learn a lot from New Zealand. When you speak to even our Māori politicians who are in the House, we'll talk about how democracy has failed Māori, and these are MPs in our House, which, our Parliament is made up of nearly 25% Māori, and we're only 15% of the population. So to suggest that democracy has failed Māori is ridiculous, but they're still
Mm.
perpetuating this idea that we have this terrible. Now, Joe Bloggs citizen, we're getting on fine, but when you look at this, this narrative that's being developed, we have been forced further and further apart. We've been forced to take sides, and we're forced to be effectively a victim and a villain. Is how we're being made up as a society. And in New Zealand,
Yes.
we in Māori terms, there's what you call manahiri. Manahiri are your visitors, and tangata whenua are your people of the land. So we have manahiri and tangata whenua, and we're telling kids in school that you are manahiri or tangata whenua. Now, how do you tell a child that they're a visitor to the nation? They're here at the discretion of someone else. I mean, that's just the most destructive thing you can tell a society. So this concept of inclusivity and one peopleness has been shifted so far to be so divided, and it's been perpetuated by a government narrative that effectively says that that Māori have a special right and special privilege that shouldn't be given to everyone else. And it started off just as you're using in Australia, the language of, we want to hear and we want to listen and we want to make sure. And and
And
yeah,
reconciliation, because I can see reconciliation as
and
part
it
of that.
hasn't. What it's done is it's basically encouraged a victim narrative, and so therefore we have developed an anger that hasn't existed before. Now, I'm an ex-cop. Like I did most of my police service in South Auckland, which is and and
Mm.
at, at no point did we you just there were people who were good and bad. There was no this, but we've had our current police commissioner come out and say that the police are systemically racist, and we suffer from institutional racism. Now, how does that? I know lots of cops. There's bad people and good people, and they try to help the good people and protect them from the bad people, and that's about it. Now, when you start getting into all of these debates about, systemic racism and institutional racism and all those sort of things, we've paralysed our police force. We have escalating violent crime. We have out of control youth crime. All of these things that were supposed to be addressed because we made it all about race and less about, people just doing the best we can for people. And that's, I think, the saddest thing that's occurring in New Zealand.
Yes, and I think a similar thing in Australia. The notion that Australia's a racist country. Of course, there's racism, but I think that we're also a spectacularly successful multicultural
Yeah,
society. Often under recognised how wonderfully
yeah.
we actually do get along. And also the notion that Indigenous people, as I understand, it's drummed into us the concept that Indigenous people suffer from racism, and I'm sure that they do, but the as I understand from the Indigenous people themselves and on their day to day lives, that they're not really complaining that Australia is inherently
No,
racist.
and what it does is it distracts you from real solutions, because then you start looking at the race side of things and not just about what's the best for people. For people, what do they
Mm,
need? Putting aside,
mm,
this idea of race, and similar to, I mean, I've seen it, in terms of the attacks on Jacinta Price for daring to say that this is the last thing that that is needed in Australia, that people should be treated as people. You don't start dividing people by race, and she's been attacked. You know, uh, Similar to what we find in New Zealand. I mean, I get attacked constantly that that you're that demanding equality before the law and protection of equal citizenship is inherently racist because I'm disrespecting Māori. We've had ministers of the Crown who have accused other MPs in Parliament of being useless Māori because they don't agree with what this Māori says. So therefore, you're not advocating for Māori how I believe you should be advocating for Māori. So therefore, you must be useless. And the media have said nothing. When a minister of the Crown has stood up and accused another MP of being a useless Māori, and the media almost said nothing. Then on top of that, we have a wonderful MP, Karen Chor, who has herself Māori, grew up in a welfare um, um, placement. She was, sort of in the foster care system. She's married to, I think, a Cambodian husband. She has mixed race children. Talking about, and she was advocating for. We have a Ministry of Children, Oranga Tamariki, and she was advocating for accountability for the failures of this ministry to deliver better outcomes for children. She was in the House advocating for this. A Māori MP across from the House says um, that she's seeing the world through a vanilla lens, and she needs to cross the bridge, which is to Tiritia Waitangi, our Treaty of Waitangi, to see the world from a Māori perspective. Now, how can you allow that to happen, where one Māori is apparently allowed to denigrate the other Māori because they don't agree with each other? To suggest we have one voice, to suggest that we can all, because we're Māori, we all, think the same and behave the same and want the same, is just an insult to who we are as people. And that's what we've
Well,
got
and it
to.
takes a high moral ground in a sense in a debate, you using race as an actual valid
Yeah,
argument. I mean, imagine if our Chinese or
yeah,
white or Cambodian, whatever race was in a parliament, was effectively saying, "Hey, come on, we're all of that particular race. We've got to stick together." But not necessarily on the merits of the
Yeah,
argument, but based on the notion of
yeah.
race.
And the thing is,
Hasn't been. Yeah, go.
just the thing is that when you politicize this discussion, when you have politicians who are able to play a race card and drive their agenda based upon their position, and you can't challenge it because that would be racist, because I'm speaking as a Maori and therefore I can, then you've lost your democracy right there, regardless of what you do further than that. If you say that I'm able to do this, and we have done this. Now, we have had legislation passed that has appointed unelected Maori representation onto local government authorities. They can never be kicked off, but they are part
Mm.
of the voting rights of that council. They can they have, but they are, through legislation, have been appointed to those positions, and they do not face a democratic process. They cannot be kicked out, because we've said that this voice needs to be heard, this representation needs to be heard. And this is what's occurring, this encroachment, this slowly.
It's a non-democratically. It doesn't have a
No,
mandate in a
exactly.
democratic sense that we value to give power to the represent. We have
And yeah,
representative
and the fundamental
democracy.
thing of democracy, though, is that you can kick them out. That at the next election, those
Yeah.
people can be kicked out for whatever reason.
Mm.
That there has to be an
Mm.
accountability. And when you have a democratic process that says purely by race, because the other confounding
Well,
factor
we're
is,
a story in Australia. As I understand it, under the Calma Langton report, the notion of it's not just elected representatives that will be part of the voice, but also
yeah.
appointed representatives. Another mechanism for being on the
And the
voice.
danger for your voice is that when, just as we've gone through this experience, the danger is that when government says you will be listened to and we will make better decisions and things will be better for you, that's where your court case is. And when they say this won't, this isn't statute, this isn't going to be law, there's nothing, it's just a nice to have thing. When your government says this is what you're going to do, and out of this there will be better decisions and your voice will be heard, we ended up in court purely for that, because our voice wasn't getting heard and there weren't better outcomes. So we're now, and our tribunal, our Waitangi tribunal, is hearing ridiculous things now. The recent one we had with the COVID issues was that COVID was being distributed, the vaccines were being distributed to the elderly first. So that was really important because they were the high risk demographic. There was a claim
Mm.
taken to the Waitangi Tribunal because Māori die younger than everyone else. So therefore Māori should be given the vaccine first rather than on the age basis, but on the race basis. So therefore, a perfectly healthy, a Māori All Black, in peak physical condition, could effectively qualify ahead of an elderly person for the vaccine purely based on race. And that was the type of decisions that have come out in New Zealand. This is the type of stuff where the tribunal has been, weaponised to divide out our nation. And it's just a growing momentum.
I noticed similar stories in the United States. Last week there was an article in the New York Times about the notion of sovereignty and land ownership, and where the indigenous were charging, for example, tolls to access for the non-indigenous people to travel through on the roads there. Are these types of issues occurring when it comes to land or water
So we've
or?
had private land occupations. So we had, um, a long story short, there was a land that was in private ownership, that had been in private ownership for a couple of 100 years, and it was, or at least 150 years, and it was to be developed by a large construction company into a large residential community. And as part of the consent process, this consultation thing to listen to local Māori, the construction company, consulted what we call the kaumatua, the elders of a tribe or a hapu, and a group of elders were consulted, and the construction company agreed that the local Māori community would get 40 homes out of the subdivision. Not that they were property owners, not that they were entitled, but as part of the consent process, they were going to gift these homes to the Māori. Now, another, Māori entity within that group of, that iwi, that tribe, said that no, they didn't want this land developed because it was, spiritual connections, and this sort of, there was a whole lot of arguments. So they occupied the land to prevent the construction going ahead. It was an illegal occupation. It was private land. It was privately owned. Our government intervened in order to bring an end to it, despite there being a lot of disagreement within government itself as to what they should do. And effectively, public money, taxpayer money, was used to buy this piece of land at $60 million off the developers and give it back to this, a Māori controlled entity. Now, that piece of land, which would have given, this was in South Auckland, so it was an area that desperately needed housing. That piece of land that was going to be 40 homes for Māori gifted to them is now just a paddock overrun with, shacks and pieces of, old signs from the occupation. No development's gone forward, and it'll be years before we see anything. Now, that's just one example of the types of things that were happening. During the COVID lockdowns, and New Zealand was famous for these, we did lockdowns better than I think anyone else in the world. We had Māori, self-appointed Māori, who were blocking roads on the basis that they were claimed to be protecting their people. Now, the roads they weren't blocking were only accessed by Māori. They were just residential areas in the Northland. And they were illegal roadblocks, but they weren't stopped from making those roadblocks. And eventually they scurried around to throw a couple of token police on there to pretend like it was a joint effort. But they were just illegal roadblocks that were set up based upon, I'm Māori and I'm going to look after my people. And that was, that's the type of activity that goes on. And we become more and more divided. We did some scientific polling last year, and it determined that 72% of New Zealanders believe that we're more divided than we were a year ago as a people. And that's pretty much reflective of the sentiment. We have become more and more divided. And what's occurring is that the resentment is against Māori, even if you agree that what they're doing is wrong, that you've created a racial divide because of some people who claim to speak for us. And the saddest thing is we're not getting better outcomes. I could tolerate some of this if it meant that there was actually things happening, that we were getting better education outcomes, or something positive was coming out of it, but it's not.
I think you've got an analogy about a toad and
a frog
and
slowly heating water. And
take us through it.
The part with is the old story about the you put a frog in boiling hot water, it'll jump straight out. But you put a frog in cold water and slowly heat the water, and he will die in the hot water because he won't know the water's got too hot to live in. And we have literally become the society where the water is just heated and heated and heated, and we've been tolerating it and tolerating, and it's not going to sustain life soon. We're going to become so conflicted, and the part that makes me so upset is this inability to have a clear conversation about what's the best thing to do. What do we need to do? What's the best thing to do? We're so busy making it about a race discussion, not about who's the best. And when we're talking about,
I was speaking to a fellow called Andrew Dillon. I don't know whether you know him. He was saying that effectively that Aboriginal affairs are everybody's affairs. That is at the end of the day, we all bleed the same, and that we all have similar needs. That is, and he took like
Yeah,
housing, a safe environment to live in, food, food, water, and things like that. And generally, no, our democratic representatives, no matter what their race, have an understanding of what it takes to be a human being, and that we have more
yeah,
commonalities, but than we have
yeah,
differences. And as a consequence, and I see it like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That is, you need food and
yeah,
water and housing and safety and security and things like that. And if we can tick those boxes, then in a sense, harmony, social cohesion should work. And that it's he argues that you don't need to be some type of racial expert
yeah,
to be able to manage the good outcomes
yeah.
for people. And
And as a government, what you do is you abdicate responsibility for delivering better outcomes because you're saying, you guys look after your stuff, you know, and
mm,
that's not, a government should be accountable for its people. And that's what,
who pays the tax? Do they have a different
no,
tax
no,
arrangement?
and this is the part, is that, so what you've got to say is that, exactly that point. There was polling done early last year, which was talking about, what are polling Maori voters, specifically polling Maori voters, and saying what are the top 10 issues for Maori voters coming into the next election. And shock horror, cost of living, housing,
Mm,
employment, health, crime, the same for everybody. That these
yeah.
arbitrary divisions that are being forced on us by a government agenda is is just meaning that they avoid accountability for not delivering for those who are in need, regardless of what race they are. And if your most in need happen to all be Aboriginals or Torres Strait Islanders or Maori, then they will get the bulk of what's needed to
Yeah,
be delivered. But you don't start the
absolutely.
policy based upon, this is how we're going to divide it. And because therefore those who, and I come across them all the time, highly successful, you know financially very secure Māori, who will be entitled for a bigger cut of the pie, not because of their need, but just purely because of their race. And that's where you fall over as a society, because we should be
Mm,
measured by those with greatest need and how we support those with greatest need. And that's what's occurring with our health system. They said that we've got to divide the health system because Māori have health, poorer
mm.
health outcomes, so therefore they live shorter lives, so therefore we're going to divide our health system. Now, health is a finite budget. There's only so much you can do. And when you're going to split that budget into a whole lot of bureaucracy that's going to create two bureaucratic systems, Māori Health and Health New Zealand, totally separate systems, imagine how many operations that are going to be missed out on, how many nurses that could pay for, how many doctors that we could get,
Mm,
how many facilities we could
mm.
create, how much equipment we could buy out of this bureaucracy. And the delivery of health,
Yes. There's no economies
yeah,
of scale. We're
yeah.
doubling up on the
And
bureaucracy.
the
Ah,
delivery of health, is the point with it, is that your health outcomes are impacted by your quality of your housing, your um, access to food, your even education. So this division that we're creating to say that the delivery of health services is going to resolve all of these things that health have no responsibility for is just a waste of money and a waste of a whole lot of bureaucracy, a whole lot of time. That's and it's just tokenism.
I noticed that I think it's the United Nations have a convention on the elimination of racism, and there's two parts to that. But one of it argues is the idea that the best type of a best practice model of running a country is to have one law for all as a general principle. But there can be exceptions. For example, where positive discrimination, like we're discussing, may be applied. But it recommends that that should be time limited. because otherwise, if you don't like a voice, for example, will be effectively perpetual, and your arrangement is seemingly perpetual, you actually institutionalize racism within the fabric of the country
Yeah.
into all policy decisions.
And those
Hmm.
affirmative action, the countries that have, promoted strong levels of affirmative action, there's nowhere where it succeeded. There was a really lengthy study done about the Malay in Malaysia versus the Malay in Singapore. And in every measure, the Malay in Singapore, without any affirmative action,
Mm.
considerations, are performing better than the
Mm.
Malay in Malaysia. And in New Zealand
Mm.
is the same. And I haven't been able to find the study, but there was some, statistics gathered on Maori living in Australia versus Maori living in New Zealand, in terms of, education outcomes, home ownership, average income, those things. There's no evidence that it actually delivers what it's promoting to deliver. And that's the
And this is what Susan Price has been
yeah.
saying for
it
quite some
doesn't
time.
it doesn't achieve. And the worst thing is that it actually, the net impact is actually quite demoralizing, because as a Māori, if you achieve incredibly well, two students go through school, get the same qualifications, go through medical school, get the same qualifications, become surgeons. When you have a Māori surgeon and a non-Māori surgeon standing there, in the hearts and minds of
Mm.
everyone, you're always going to think, but was he a quota? Was this one, So you actually undermine their achievements by saying that there's a
Mm.
special consideration. And the
Mm.
lunacy, we had a recent legislation passed which was called the Plain English Bill. Now, in New Zealand, we have this big drive to keep the Māori language alive, but instead of keeping the Māori language alive, we're reducing it down to little phrases and terms that we throw into English language. Now, anybody who studies languages knows that's not how you keep a language alive, by cutting it up into little. So we end up with kind of this pidgin Maori English kind of thing that is disrespectful to the Maori language, as far as I'm concerned. Now we passed this legislation. That legislation produced by government needed to be in plain English so that people reading it could understand it. But they created an exemption to say, but it didn't apply for when they use Maori language. So we have legislation being passed with Maori terms in it that haven't been defined. They're not defined in the interpretations. They're not. So this kind of growing amount of legislation that I know we're going to be debating for the next 50 years as to what was the nuance meant by using this term in this piece of legislation. And
Oh, I see they're using Maori language within
yeah,
the
yeah,
structure
yeah.
and, excuse my ignorance, but in Australia, I mean, at the time of settlement, there would have been hundreds of languages, 250 rolls off the top of my head. There would have been hundreds of languages in Australia, and there still are. They're in actual fact, I won't go down that path of language, but are there many languages, Maori languages?
There's I'd say there's more dialects, so there's slightly different. Um, that
Yeah,
words mean slightly
all right.
different in different.
A more
Yeah,
homogenous approach than in the
yeah,
Australian
but it
context.
wasn't a written language.
Yeah.
It became a written language later, and it's sort of like, I think in New Zealand it's a little
Mm.
bit when you used to speak Latin. If you speak Maori, it's sort of this badge of honor.
So I assume language has become part of that cultural war. That is a requirement that language. That's what you're talking about. It's being built into the structural clauses of Parliament, but also is it requirement in schools
So
and things
they
like that?
and I've always supported the fact that the Māori language should be made available, but there's been a push to try and make it compulsory, that that Māori should be compulsory in school. Now it's not. We school, our education outcomes in New Zealand are probably one of, getting close to some of the worst in the Western world in terms of our achievements. And they're trying to distract teachers by saying, oh, we've just introduced a New Zealand history curriculum, which has been broadly criticised by both sides of the argument in terms of what's been included in this history curriculum, but particularly by historians who've said that the development of this curriculum has don't have the academic credentials to have developed it. But it's also about it's less about the factual account of history and more about sort of telling people what you should think about our history. And that's kind of that distortion that's occurring. Now that's been introduced, and our last Prime Minister was very proud of the fact that she was going to introduce this into our schools. Now, when we have some of the worst literacy, numeracy outcomes in school education, the high number of children leaving school without the ability to read is an affront. But in true woke virtue signalling approaches, we've introduced a compulsory history curriculum into our schools. It's just we forget about what's good outcomes. And this is where, in terms of what Centre Price is doing, is this ability to circumvent better outcomes in order to say we're doing something rather than actually be accountable for doing something is where the challenge will really be seen, is that it has to be about what works. And we had a system in New Zealand called charter schools, and they were schools that were established outside the national education syllabus. They were targeted schools for kids to best meet needs, and there were some really excellent charter schools that were set up that were achieving some of the best outcomes for Māori in New Zealand. There was a pseudo-military type style school. There was they were really achieving great outcomes for kids. Our current Labor government of kindness, their first move when they came into government in 2017 was to eliminate the charter schools because the charter schools teachers weren't unionised. So in true Labor government form, they got rid of it. Now there is at least two significant ministers in the current Labor government who were strong advocates. They were Māori and strong advocates of the charter schools, and one of them, Kelvin Davis, actually said it was his bottom line that if charter schools went, he would leave politics. Charter schools went, and he became deputy leader of the Labor Party, and not another word was said. So you forego good outcomes for your political gain. And that's the type of thing that I think happens when you make it about race and less about delivery of outcomes.
Well, I think that we've been going some time, and that's a very, in fact, the whole discussion that we've had has been totally enlightening. Because in a sense we've covered such a long period of time, in a sense from 1840 into the 70s, and the ramifications right up to now over the last 50 years. So I'd really like to say that was enlightening, and I really thank you very much for your contribution to the
No
discussion.
problem at all.